All right, well, we're really excited to have Dan Becker here with us today. Like I said earlier, he is from Personhood Alliance and a good friend of my husband's, which makes him a good friend of mine. And we're glad to welcome Dan.
Thank you, Haley. Fourth time in a row. Fourth in a row that I've gotten the dead zone immediately after lunch. You know, you look out into the crowd and you see the living dead as you zombie in your seats. And, you know, I have a unique relationship with zombies. I had a Hollywood producer come to my home in Georgia wanting to film the second season of The Walking Dead, whatever that was. And they wanted to offer me $300,000 to do so. Can you imagine? As the president of Georgia Right to Life, what the headlines would be the next day? You can't make this stuff up. I mean, it's just incredible. So if I see you zombieing out, we'll do something to zap you there, keep you in the fold. I really appreciate very much the opportunity to come up here, second year in a row. I'm not your premier speaker. Guabe Jones was to fill this slot as our national policy director for Personhood Alliance, a new national group that is less than 100 days old.
Wow.
100 days. We haven't even got our business cards printed yet. And Guabe got a call from the president and attorney general of the country of Panama. And they wanted him tomorrow down in Panama. Guabe is writing and has been asked to write a human rights amendment on personhood for the OAS, the Organization of American States. Canadian, US, everybody, Central and South America are members of that. So it's a tremendous privilege on our part to be part of a human rights advance in the Western Hemisphere. And when the call came in, he said, I'm coming from Mexico City, and I'm coming to Anchorage, and I've got to figure out how to do that and get back to Panama in 30 hours. And there just wasn't any way. So I'm your second choice here. I didn't know I was coming until a week and a half ago. We at Personhood Alliance, and I am the president, outgoing president of Georgia Right to Life as well. Appreciate working with Catherine and Ryan, both from within the organizational structure in Georgia, helping to launch some national ministries out of the state of Georgia. We were, and you may not know this, forcefully invited to leave National Right to Life last April after 40 years of membership. I was involved at a National Right to Life board level with Christopher Kirka, for the last 4 years, and enjoyed his support as we attempted to reform the movement from within, without a lot of hoopla or fuss or anything else. The Right to Life movement, in my opinion, as a CEO going on 34 years, having started 7 companies, only a handful of which were successful, moderately successful, I know how businesses run. And when a company is not working, and it's been 42 years, when a company is not working, you can do 2 things. You need to examine the business plan, or you need to change the management. And we tried from within the movement for many years to do just that, to have them reevaluate. 15 years ago, Georgia Right to Life changed its business plan from the National Right to Life model. We went to a no exceptions, no compromise position on the endorsement of candidates, which they said couldn't be done. You can't do that and advance the movement pragmatically. Well, they were right in some cases and they were wrong in others, because as of this year, we have been in the top 15 most protected state status, according to AUL, for the last 7 years, having passed incremental law after incremental law to protect the preborn and all of us, the elderly. We have one of the toughest anti-assisted suicide laws in the nation. We are the only one of 2 states, Michigan and Georgia, that have no rape and incest in any of our legal code, because we only endorse candidates that are pure sanctity of life candidates. And by the way, we got our results in November politically on our PAC. 98.7% victory, one of the highest in the nation. We have endorsed 79 candidates, 78 of them won handily. We are the only state in the nation whose statewide elected officials constitutionally, governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, secretary of state, school superintendent, insurance commissioners, public service commissioners, are all pro-life without exceptions, with a proper life of the mother exception. Now, you would think that from a corporate standpoint, that pragmatic, empirical data would make a difference. And it was acknowledged. But the movement, in my opinion, is broken. And I'm not the only one to acknowledge it. How many of you know who Jack Wilkie is as the father of the American pro-life movement? He was the original founder, 10 years president of National Right to Life, and this book was released 2 weeks ago. And in it, he states that the movement is broken. It cannot advance. It's been 42 years. It is time to reevaluate who and what we are as a movement and where we're going. And we really appreciate the support of many of the other groups out there. Right now we have over 36 Right to Life groups around the nation who in the last 100 days have joined the efforts of Personhood Alliance to make a difference in our generation and in our day. What's the difference? Well, the biggest one, we're faith-based. Let me say that again. Jesus Christ is centerpiece of our organization. Now, if that sounds strange to you coming from a pro-life leader, it's because it is. We believe that 2,000 years of church history has demonstrated that culture after culture after culture must bow to the gospel of Jesus Christ as it confronts the death culture of child sacrifice in Greece, in Rome, in Germany, in the Celtic religions in the UK. Culture after culture collapsed to a sanctity of life position where a high view of human dignity and the value of human life held sway. I believe we can do it again. I believe that we're living in a time of renewal, and what I want to share with you today is a continuation of the series that I presented last year. How many of you were here for the Ideas Have Consequences, where I featured 2 ideas current in culture today affecting public policy called transhumanism and eugenics? Anybody here for that presentation? Okay, good, just a handful. So this will be new material to most of you. No apologies for those that have seen some of it before. It's always good to refresh. Personhood Alliance. When we were only 45 days old, I received an invitation by the Morton Blackwell Leadership Institute out of DC to be the keynote speaker in the Netherlands for the International Pro-Life Federation, which is a gathering of pro-life leaders from country after country around the world. It was a wonderful opportunity to present a new approach to what we believe the Lord is doing in the pro-life movement. The message literally was the day before the March for Life, celebration of their Roe v. Wade on December 4th. And we marched in front of the Parliament building with the largest pro-life gathering in European history. The day before, when I presented at the symposium of world leaders, I had been given the premier spot right after lunch, and thought, well, okay, we'll see how this goes. They gave all of the professors and PhDs 30 minutes to present their papers, and they gave me an hour and 45 minutes. And it wasn't expressly said by all of the other speakers, but the one just before me came up to me and said, "Who are you? And why do you get an hour and 45 minutes? We're going to cut you down. We're going to give you 1 hour to say what you can say, and that's more than generous. That's twice as much as the rest of us." And I was fine with that. At the end of 1 hour, he was the first one to call for another hour. And at the conclusion of that time, I had 6 invites to Durban, South Africa, Paris, France. I had invites to India, and I am booked in Durban, South Africa, and in Jerusalem, Israel. I'm going to share with you basically what I shared with them. It's about what he spoke on. Dr. Michael Vandermast, to the right of the screen, standing next to me, spoke for 30 minutes just prior to my getting up on a little village in Germany by the name of Hadamar. Hadamar is a quaint, beautiful village nestled against the Rhine. And castles, and cathedrals, and castle squares. We were there the week before Christmas. He spoke on Hadamar. After half an hour, he sat down, and I got up, and my first picture was Hadamar. Hadamar, Germany. And immediately tied into everything that he had just shared. Talk about providential. The Lord very carefully choreographed the timing and everything of the message of personhood to the EU. And now all of the major pro-life groups in the EU have adopted the Personhood Alliance stance on the sanctity of life being faith-based, no exceptions, no compromise. And we are now sharing that around the world. And that's before we even have our business cards printed. So, praise God for the favor that he has given. What's so special about Hadamar, Germany, and why was that in focus is because last week was the 70th anniversary of the Allies liberating Europe from the Nazis. Now, I want to give a caveat here for parents with small children. We have got 2 slides in here that are rather graphic, and it has a caution sign that I will give you ample warning so that you can deal with children if you don't want them exposed to a rather graphic scene. But I have to tell you that ideas have consequences. Ideas have consequences, and it is the luxury of history to look back and be able to connect the dots. It is the visionary, the future gazer, who can see where we are today and where it is leading us. And I want to tell you that being anti-abortion, saving the babies as our singular focus in the arena of the doctrine of Imago Dei is wholly inadequate. Wholly inadequate. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't be anti-abortion. I'm saying both and. We need to be forward-looking because the sanctity of life is coming under attack in ways that are historical. Why do I care? And I do this, I get this in every time. This is 23 of my 26 grandchildren. And they're growing. Time is passing. And as time passes, I believe that we are moving further and further down a timeline of consequences that we either act now or we will be the recipients of. I'm going to introduce you to a new concept. Transhumanism and eugenics is what I focused on last time. This time, it's a public policy term, philosophy, known as utilitarianism. Taking root back in the 1800s, early 1800s, Jeremy Bentham wrote a book on morals, but it was from a secular humanist perspective. It had no mention of God or the establishment of absolutes for right and wrong. What was the absolute that was established? He coined the term, the greatest good for the greatest number. Utilitarianism as a public policy concept, and one that I want to highlight today as the featured ideas have consequences. Pope Benedict XVI rightly identified it when he said, under traditional medical ethics, the guiding principle for most doctors is do no harm. But contemporary bioethics abandons this in an effort to find the utilitarian goal of the greatest good for the greatest number. Under these principles, preserving the life of the human patient is not considered paramount. And any of you, and I've met Iris, who's from Sitka, who works in a hospice end-of-life care facility, the change from palliative care, where you minister to pain and alleviate the suffering, has given way to feudal care, which evaluates the utility of the patient. If the patient has no future utility under a scoring regimen, quantitative analysis, then they are given feudal care, which means they're not given care, and in many cases food and hydration is withheld. The hospice movement was a response to feudal care coming in a godless way and increasing suffering and pain. And the Christians that sponsored hospice care did a yeoman's job of establishing godly principles for end-of-life human dignity. And then it was taken over 5 years ago by the euthanasia crowd. So now hospice care is at risk. If you know someone, be sure that you have a will to live document. You can go, and I recommend National Right to Life's website, where you can get a will to live document for your state that establishes your desire for end-of-life concerns. Utilitarianism, according to Wikipedia, the source of all human wisdom, it's a theory that involves a fiscal element. It's an economic analysis that is human-centered or anthropocentric and has a moral foundation, so-called. It has a sales feature. In other words, right now today, under Obamacare, how many of you are familiar with your medical record quality of life score? Right there on your medical record, quality of life score. If your utility does not meet a certain standard in quality of life years expected, then you will not receive treatment under the Obama plan. Well, that's okay. I have my own money, and I'll pay for my... No, you won't pay for your own. Anybody that receives your money under Obamacare for services not authorized by Obamacare loses their membership in the plan. That's how it's being controlled, and that's how it's being implemented. We ran into this in Georgia in 2012. It was an interesting scenario. We had our own 20-week pain-capable bill that we were supporting big time. We had a clean bill. It had no rape and incest exceptions. It had no fetal anomalies. It didn't have any language, and we passed it through the toughest chamber, which was the Georgia House. When we did so, It went to the Senate, which should have been a slam dunk for us. And 5 rogue Republican senators we caught wind were offering an amendment that would define medically futile pregnancies. And here is what they said. Any pregnancy where the fetus is anencephalic, no brain, just a lower cortex, or that a diagnosis of Potter's syndrome, whatever that was, or a congenital or chromosomal anomaly made that is incompatible with life. Now, when we find negative amendments being applied to our bills, we research them. First thing you do is you plug it into Google to find out what the origin is. Is it coming from, we knew it was coming from the Georgia Medical Association. Well, what about the American Medical Association? Were they sponsoring this language? ACOG, American College of Gynecology, the other bad guys in the room. When I plugged that language into Google, it pulled up the U.S. Holocaust Museum. An article it directed me to by 2 men in the 1920s, Hocha and Bindi. One was a psychiatrist, the other was a lawyer, and they advocated that due to the cost and utility of taking care of children with Potter's syndrome and anencephaly, that the best thing that we can do is to kill these useless eaters. Utilitarianism, 1920. Now, let me remind you, Hitler did not take power until 1933. He was in jail at this time, writing Mein Kampf. So this was not Nazi thinking, this is the Weimar Republic of Germany after World War I. And they were talking about economic savings of killing useless eaters. And that language was identical language showing up in our Georgia bill. We were able to defeat that one, but we couldn't stave off the one, a fetal anomaly clause that was introduced by National Right to Life. First time a eugenic law had ever been passed in Georgia. We withdrew our support of the bill in the final hours of the session, 3 hours before it ended, and had our first eugenic law passed in the state of Georgia. That law, by the way, has been enjoined for 2 years, will never see the light of day, will never be enacted, and of the 212 laws that have been passed, AUL was asked last 2 weeks ago how many of them had been successfully prosecuted, and Charmaine Yost answered, not many or none. What is the purpose for passing law that the state, as Catherine so eloquently pointed out, won't enforce? We've got a problem in the pro-life movement. Our problem is the hearts and minds of people sitting in the pews, sitting elsewhere, being exposed to a whole host of messages that counter our sanctity of life. And what are we talking about? Saving politicians. Germany's slippery slope began with Potter's syndrome, children born with anencephaly, the trisomy conditions, which they didn't call them that at the time, including Down syndrome. But any slippery slope immediately progresses downward. And they added the medically futile, the incurably ill. It makes sense, but then they crossed a line. Perfectly healthy, blind, deaf, or dumb children were added to the list. Then the mentally challenged and the elderly. And then it progressed to the half-breeds who were genetically impure by a eugenic policy. And then ultimately the Holocaust itself. And we know how that worked out. How does a country like Germany, rich in Christian heritage, both Catholic and Protestant, end up supporting a Holocaust? How do they do it? It began right here in the early 20s in Hadamar, Germany, that quaint little village. No, that isn't concentration camp victims being burned. There weren't any. There were no concentration camps. This is the hospital there, a psychiatric hospital in Hadamar. As I said, hyperinflation was running rampant, took a wheelbarrow of cash to buy a loaf of bread. What they would do under this plan, beginning in 1939, now it took roughly 19 years, so add that to your timeline. Where are we today in this slippery slope? And if you put a cap of 19 years on it before the killing actually begins, you tell me where you think we are. These children who were picked up at the hospitals and the delivery rooms initially were delivered to the killing center and disposed of. But that's not where it stopped. Pretty soon they were going into German homes and removing other children, 6, 7, 8, 9-year-old children, and bringing them to the facility there at Hadamar, where this matronly group of nurses, 3 of which were jailed at the conclusion of the war, where they would meet the children and remove them from the school bus. The children were removed from German homes under the auspices of blindness, deafness, dumbness, slow learning disability, bedwetting, to be treated psychiatrically with the best medical knowledge Germany had to bear. And they were never seen again. 6 weeks later, their parents would receive an urn of ashes with some cockamamie illness that killed them, like appendicitis, even though the young child had had their appendix out 3 years before. Things of that nature. They were ushered into the basement where they were told to disrobe and put on a hospital gown for a medical examination. And while there, a physician met them, evaluated them based on their case record, and put one of 3 different colored Band-Aids on their arm. Those 3 categories, they were then sent to the waiting room outside the shower, where they were going to take a shower for the evening. And it was there that these Band-Aids were followed. Kill them, or if they were psychiatric patients, kill and remove their brain for research, or if they were older patients, kill and remove their gold teeth. 1939, 1940, 1941, 70 children every other day. I saw the list. I saw the charts. I saw the figures every other day, 70 at a time. Those that were to advance scientific knowledge and research were dissected in the dissection room. And then their little bodies were cremated. These 2 ovens were the prototype that eventually was reproduced identically in Auschwitz, Dachau, all of the concentration camps, because the technology for killing was developed in this quaint little German town. Meet some of the children. Anna, no other problem than diagnosed with Down syndrome. Little 7-year-old Carl, who was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Does anybody know a 7-year-old boy that isn't schizophrenic in some way? Nameless little children who, as bedwetters, developmentally slow, low grades in school at 8, 9 years of age, needed to be removed from the gene pool eugenically. Those that were half-breeds, gypsies and Jews, for no other reason than their genetic heritage. Should we value a human life based on their manner of conception? Then why do we ever allow rape and incest exceptions to any of our pro-life bills? It damages our underlying ability to argue effectively for the sanctity of life. Not to mention that Deuteronomy 24:16 in God's Word says, "You shall not put a child to death for the crimes of his father." Little blind 6-year-old girl who was thrown into the air repeatedly to see how she would respond to the free fall mode as a blind girl. And little Baron von Ettenberger. Yeah, German nobility, without a question, who was being treated at an adjoining facility for a very minor condition and got on the wrong school bus coming home and was never seen again. In 1941, 10,000 children had met their fate. And it was a false fate, and their parents knew it. And they literally went up against Hitler, Himmler, Goebbels, the propaganda machine of the Nazi regime, and won. They marched in the streets. Bishop from Ulm called out the evil that was going on in Hadamar, exposed it, and because of his high-profile Catholic bishop, the Nazis couldn't touch him. But they beheaded 3 of the priests who passed out the sermon denouncing Hadamar. The cost was in. How many of you have ever heard of Baptist pastor Martin Niemöller? A few of you? He spoke out, but much later because of fear of the SS and the Gestapo, and he ended up spending 7 years in a concentration camp because of Hadamar. In 1965, when they rededicated Hadamar as a memorial to the children who died, he was the guest speaker. Germany's slippery slope can't happen here. It will if we don't answer these 2 questions. When are we human, and when do legal rights attach? You heard Catherine talk about personhood in the law, in the Constitution, the various steps that were made and taken to allow a class known as Negroes to enjoy full personhood under the law. You see that bottom row? Every single one on that bottom row are having their personhood questioned today. Today, here in America. We can cite you cases after case after case. Beginning with my friend Peter Singer. A year ago when I was here, I mentioned that I was just fresh a couple weeks from Yale University Personhood Symposium. Since I met you last, an orangutan in Brazil has been granted personhood. To murder the orangutan is tantamount to human murder, and you will be executed or go to jail. Dolphins in India enjoy personhood, so there's no dolphin shows in captivity in India. Peter Singer is, according to, once again, this is not me, this is Wikipedia, the greatest living philosopher of our day. He holds the bioethics chair at Princeton University, and he is the evangelist, the #1 spokesman when you go out on Obamacare and look at Obamacare. Peter Singer, this professor. What's wrong with his position? Well, he defines personhood differently than you or I would. He believes that if they can feel pain, if they have free will and the capacity to plan for the future, if they have self-awareness, self-recognition, self-interest, then you're a person. Sounds good in a utilitarian sort of way. What happens, though, when you encounter somebody who's temporarily comatose? They don't meet that condition. Or how about a misdiagnosis of being in a persistent vegetative state, like our own Georgia House Rep, Roger Bacon, I think. Roger was in a coma, and the doctors came and told his wife he was brain dead. Roger Bruce. Roger Bruce said in a hearing in front of doctors, pro-lifers and everything, and by the way, he is a Democrat, and when they pronounced him brain dead, I tended to agree with that particular portion of it. Because in Georgia, to be a Democrat is to be the most liberal radical, because all the boll weevil Democrats have crossed over and become Republicans. We have no moderate Democrats in Georgia. He said, if it hadn't been for my God-fearing wife, I'd be dead and sliced and diced today. And he's absolutely right. The rush to organ harvesting has a financial incentive that we're going to talk about in just a minute. Alzheimer's patients, stages of dementia. These are all people who have had their personhood stripped from them either by the law and are now called post-persons. We've had Supreme Court cases in Georgia where the ruling for a comatose, brain-dead tourist from Florida was that he is now a post-person. You can unplug him. So it's all about personhood. How many of you knew that personhood was the initial objective of the pro-life movement? 1968 through 78? For 10 years, for a decade, personhood was the objective. Just simply reversing Roe v. Wade was not enough. They needed a constitutional amendment that would establish the personhood for the preborn. So the goal of the pro-life movement was to go in this direction. So when I say the title of this speech is the return to first principles, that's what I mean. All we're doing is going back and hearkening back. The history is in this book, and I recommend this book by John Wilkie, available on Amazon, to get the inside scoop of the pro-life movement for the last 42 years. And it'll give you insight into what we're facing today. Well, you know, I sat down with Peter Singer, and I asked him, I said, do you mind if we have lunch and just talk man to man? We pro-lifers tend to demonize you, and you're larger than life with all of your quotes, and I really want to know where you're coming from. I want to get past the myth to the man, and let's just break bread together. Particularly on this quote, if the parents want the newborn, it's wrong to kill the baby because that act deprives them of happiness. On the other hand, killing a defective newborn, even up to 28 days after birth, is not the moral equivalent to killing a person. Open admission. He's now since moved that to a perfectly healthy toddler through 18 months because they're not cognitive, self-aware, or any of the other definitions that he's written down. Why is that important? Because he is the spokesperson for the Independent Payment Advisory Board appointed by President Obama, who will decide who receives treatment under his utilitarian quality of life score plan. You've heard of the death panels. This is where they come from. And Peter Singer is right at the top. Peter Singer lost 2 grandparents in the Holocaust in Germany. He's Jewish. And I thought he would answer one way, and I was shocked when he answered another. So what if abortion ends life? The fetus is indeed alive, a life worth sacrificing. We were talking about messaging with Matt Walsh. Messaging has changed in the pro-abortion camp. They're no longer saying it's a woman's choice. They're admitting it's a life. But it's a life worth sacrificing. I want to tell you, when I read that in 2013, my blood chilled. After 40 years in the pro-life movement, I couldn't believe we had turned that corner. I knew the day was coming. It happened in 2013 in the public media. And they are now talking about a woman's life as opposed to the other's life. It's no longer a question of is it a baby or not. All life is not equal. Do you see the slippery slope and where we're going? Here's how they did it in Germany. It's called propaganda. Do you see that large category to the left? This is a poster showing how much it costs to take care of the physically infirm. That's what the German translates into. Physically infirm. See that gold at the bottom? That's how much every day it costs to take care of a physically infirm person. Kind of like that man right there, second from the bottom. Nice coat and tie, walking with a cane, strolling down the Strasse. They began building an image that the elderly were not a utility to the society. Where do we get that? You see those little 2 coins all the way over to the right? That's how much it costs to house, feed, and provide for a Deutsch worker of the people. An average worker of the people only costs a little bit to maintain. But the elderly are the single largest demographic, and we need to do something about them. And so they became, from 1941, when Hitler was forced to shut down Hadamir, the next victims, the elderly, the infirm. These are the faces of those who were taken and whose utility was done away with. And when I asked Peter Singer, aren't you afraid that the German atrocities that we saw on that slippery slope for denigrating the value of innocent human life will degrade here in America? And his answer was, we are already doing it. We just need to codify it and bring it into some kind of code. Chilling. Chilling. Now, if we're not aware, if you're not hearing this, we are on a path where ideas have consequences. What do they all have in common? Post-birth abortion. As the baby boomers, such as myself and Catherine, sorry, I'm speaking for you, Catherine, we're moving into our end-of-life years. We're the largest single demographic in the population today, and we're going to suck all of the resources out of the room. There is going to have to be rationing because we have an unlimited need and a limited amount of medical resources. And you're going to see the right to die, which has moved in 4 states into law, to what is now being written about beginning in October of this last year, a duty to die. Did you see the Atlantic magazine front cover? I hope I die by the time I'm 75. Obama's second in command for Obamacare. Building up from a right to die, a right to privacy, a right to the privacy of my own bedroom for homosexual issues, to a duty to accept me, to accept my death, to let me die, to you need to die, to involuntary death that they begin suffering. It's the historical progression, has been and always will be. They believe that all human life is not equal. Utilitarianism, be on the lookout for it. Examine your public policy speeches and see if you can't recognize the fiscal element that is being talked about that attaches to a life and death circumstance. It's coming. It's already here as far as organ harvesting. This is from May 2012. The organ harvest proceeded over the objections of the anesthesiologist who saw the brain-dead donor react to the scalpel. Discover magazine, the little byline there is Science, Technology, and the Future. Well, they are pointing out that the rush in a utilitarian way to take life, do you know that there are only 2 organs that you can not take from a dead body? Now, they're called cadaveric donations, all of them. Heart and lungs. If you take a heart or a lung, you have to rip it from a living body, both heart and lungs. The person does not succumb to the disease or the condition or the accident. On their death certificate, it says heart failure. When they cut your beating heart out to transfer to somebody else in a donation. Shades of Aztec and Mayan culture. Can anybody say that? We need to be, this secular magazine highlighted it as a problem, and the editor got fired. Human vivisection, and of course their post-persons. We've got to understand, we're not just saving babies. We are standing for the biblical truth of the Imago Dei as exhibited in God's Word, that we are created in the image and likeness of God. That you hear that very little in the pro-life movement today. Unashamed. It is the message that we need to hold in order to be effective, and by God's grace, we will be. Human dignity and the sanctity of life, we call the personhood principle. And of course, Roe v. Wade, they said the same thing. Justice Harry Blackmun wrote that if the suggestion of personhood is established, the abortion rights case, of course, collapses. It's all about personhood. If Roe v. Wade were overturned, is our pro-life movement finished? We've got the elderly who are post-persons, human embryos, 500,000 of them in a frozen state, living as long as 200 years, according to scientists. What about them? Human life, human dignity, pre-persons, severely disabled. How about human-animal hybrids? I touched on that the last time I was here. Chimeras, 98% human, 2% cow. They're using them in scientific study and Emory University and Georgia Tech, University of Georgia, and probably here in your universities as well. Why? Because they're a monstrosity that aren't legally regulated because they're not 100% human. How do you even do that? Ask me afterwards. The whole genetic testing in IVF clinics that decides who lives and who dies, and then the good death of assisted suicide. Western law has never gotten personhood right in its initial steps. We've always had to go back and get a government to acknowledge what God has already given, the inalienable right of personhood through Genesis 1:26 and 27. It's taken a civil rights outcry at a human rights level. Slavery, suffrage, women's suffrage. Women, before 1920, you were persons under the law, but only as far as pains and penalties, not rights and privileges. How do you like that? Prior to 1920, ask your great-grandma. Fact of the matter is, it took an outcry in the streets. We had to get the people out of the pews and into the streets because ideas have consequences. 100 million baby girls through gendercide. Native Americans, an Indian is not a person within the meaning of the Constitution. Congress may prevent an Indian from leaving his reservation, and while he is on the reservation, it may deprive him of his liberty, his property, his life. Now, 1881. Were you aware that this is part of our American history for our first citizens? Not a person under the law. This disturbing pattern, according to Greg Cunningham, the Center for Bioethical Reform, of disputing someone's humanity to weaken his claims to rights of personhood repeats itself again and again in Western civilization. And parents, caution sign is up. This next picture will be somewhat traumatic. Dehumanization through the denial of personhood. Okay, the picture is down. Germany suffered the consequences of their ideas and the judgment of an offended God. Every culture that is engaged in child sacrifice has done so, and why do we think we're something special? It's sobering. I live to prevent the judgment coming in my children and grandchildren's lifetime. Otherwise, I would have retired a long time ago. Do we have covered buses in our future? I think we probably do, but they'll be at the old folks' home initially. These are the exact replicas of the ovens that were at Hadamar. And parents, one more picture. This is the oven at Hadamar. This is the oven in Wichita, Kansas, with the body of a child being fed into that oven, along with the other cats and dogs that the city cremates. It took public outcry to stop the practice, just like it did in the state of Washington, to power their homes. Thank you for all being here. You are engaged. You are the ones that can make the difference in our lifetime to prevent this from being our future
Jesus said, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet." You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand. And it gives light to all in the nation in the house. Let your light so shine before men. What we're looking for today is people like you, the pro-life generation, young and old, that will minister in your pews, in your churches, through education, through changes of heart, that will lead to a turnaround in our day. Lighthouse keepers who are only needed in the midst of the storm, when the waves are the highest. And if it weren't for the fact that we knew where our anchor was, because our anchor holds only if it's upon Jesus Christ himself. If we are doing this for political reasons, if we're doing this just purely humanitarian reasons, emotional reasons to save the baby, it's not enough. We have to know where our anchor is in order to be a lighthouse keeper. I want to tell you, and I want to close on an upbeat note, there is victory. There has been throughout the ages, and I want to share with you the end of the story of Hadamar. And it begins with Dr. Siegfried Ernst, a German doctor, renowned surgeon, and this is not his picture, nor will be the pictures following. They're merely representations of the story. But Dr. Ernst, being as renowned as he was sent by the SS to Hadamar to oversee the killing and the scientific experimentation that was going on. Now, whether they knew it or not, I have to believe they did know it, he was an evangelical Lutheran, and he said to them, "No, I won't go." The Gestapo came, they picked him up, he thought that was the end. They ripped off his epaulets, off his rank, put him into a private's uniform, bound him, and sent him to the Russian front, right as Moscow, the Battle of Moscow, began. That was an assured death sentence. The tip of the spear, the division he was in, was the furthest extension of the German army that Germany ever penetrated in the Battle of the Eastern Front. And while he and his division were called to encircle Moscow, the Soviets engaged in a counter-offensive, severing the German lines and stranding Dr. Ernst behind enemy lines. A sure death sentence again. Well, he put himself to work immediately in the Russian villages as a German private who was an outstanding, surgeon. He earned their undying thanks for serving their needs and the sanctity of life. And one Russian believer, in a lull in the fighting, loaded him into his troika, the three-bladed sled, and penetrated the front lines to deliver him back to his German unit, where they marched safely back to Germany because they had borne the brunt of the battle. They were relieved and pulled off of the front line, and he was miraculously spared. When he got back after the end of the war, he started Western Doctors for Action. He advocated for peace and the sanctity of life in Germany, and he was honored by Jack Wilkie, all the way over to the right, Dr. Jack Wilkie, the father of the pro-life movement. I can't say that enough. Get his book. It's outstanding, the international work that he did. But Dr. Ernst, there on the left,
was the head of the German Right to Life movement. It was his work that led to the sanctity of life being established in the culture of Germany. Do you know what's unique about Germany today? They have the most rigid bioethics laws in Western history in Germany today. Not the most liberal eugenic laws. They have the most restrictive. Why? Because they know their history. They know ideas have consequences. And Dr. Siegfried Ernst became the head of the pro-life movement for the next 20 years in Germany. Tied remarkably in God's providence to this tiny village in Germany that became the origin of the Holocaust. And it ends on that note. There's one other providential tie, and that is, it's where my family is as well. My great-grandfather and great-great-grandfather came from a village, a couple villages over. And that is where I hearken from, my family roots, a small community there. See that window? That is the shower stall where the children were taken. There are holes all around the corners, waist high, where the school buses that brought them hooked up to a pipe and pumped carbon monoxide gas into the shower. It took 20 minutes for them to succumb. And the last thing they saw was the light from that window at ground level. They weren't tall enough to see out, but they could look up and they could see the buildings across the street. You know what they were looking at? There's the hospital at Hadamar. They were looking at the Sunday school wing of the local church. Francis Schaeffer, Dr. Francis Schaeffer, said that the abortion clinics in America should have a sign out front saying, "Open by permission of the church." It would be hard to make the case that you couldn't hear the screams of the children from across the courtyard of this church. And yet the German congregations were told to sing a little louder. First they came for the socialists, Martin Niemöller said at the dedication of the memorial at Hadamar, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unions, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. Will you be a light in the darkness? We're on a timeline, and the clock is ticking. Thank you so much.